Hello, everyone, and thank you for your patience for the second part. And so I know that this is where we left off, but I want you to turn to the next slide. And when you look at this slide, I want you to just sort of become a little more acquainted with the anatomy of the uterus, the fallopian tube, and the ovaries, or before we move on. And so recall that the ovary are where the egg cells are going to mature, the gametes of the female. And during ovulation, that is when the egg will make its way into this uterine tube, which is also again called the fallopian tube in our common day-to-day speak. And so first it will encounter these finger-like projections referred to as fimbriae, and there will be this space that is sort of considered a stalk because you'll see all these branches that come off of that stalk, and that's referred to as an infundibulum. And then as we progress through this uterine tube, there's going to be this portion called the ampulla, and the ampulla is of particular interest because typically this is where the egg will find sperm, or sperm will find egg in any direction, right? And so in this location, isthmus is just this narrow passageway. And again, uterine part is going to be this portion that is the entry into the uterine cavity or into the uterus. And so, oops, wrong thing. And so that is the passageway that an egg cell will take on its way to the uterus, because recall that the inner lining of the uterus is dedicated to catching a fertilized egg, implanting, and then initiating the process of fetal development. And within this uterine part, there are little epithelial cells that have cilia, and that's kind of what this little picture is showing. This is the inside of that uterine tube, and these cells are cells, columnar cells with cilia. And recall that cilia move mucus and substances, and so in that layer, in the mucosa layer, there's going to be cilia on the surface, pushing that egg outwards towards the uterus. And when we go into our uterus, the inside space is called the uterine cavity. There are layers to the uterus. There is the first layer. This first one is going to be called the perimetrium, which is a very special interest to us. The myometrium, this is made out of smooth muscle, and that's going to be this whole portion that you're seeing within here. Oh, I'm so sorry. I went the wrong way. Perimetrium is going to be this outer one. On the outer skirts, myometrium is the smooth muscle, and endometrium, I should have caught that faster. Endo is on the inside, or the inner lining of the uterus, where the egg hopes to implant. With that, if we look at this, we go more externally to the external world, this entryway has some structures associated with it into the uterus. For example, external O's refers to the entry going inside of the uterus. These two portions here, the boundaries, are called the cervix. Here and here. And then we have the internal O's, which is going to be a passageway similar to external, only external was that entryway. And internal O's is finally, we made it really deep into that uterine cavity. And then between the internal O's and the external O's, this space in between is considered your cervical canal. You can see that this organ, all of it, the uterine part and the uterus, is highly vascular when you look at these blood vessels, and supplied blood by the uterine artery and vein. And when we look at the uterus, remember that we have structures that are going to sound similar to the names of the stomach. For example, this fungal cap looking portion, right, if it was a fungus, right, the fungal cap part, that is going to be called fundus. And then the body is going to be the major portion of it. And again, cervix is going to be the mass that makes up the entryway. So in other words, this portion and this portion. And then here we can see the vagina where the penis would be inserted, and with the biological aim of releasing sperm into this space, and hopefully that sperm wants to make its way upwards into that uterine tube and find an egg within the ampulla. So make sure that you take a moment to learn these structures before moving on. It'll help with, just conversing about these things. And so, again, uterine tube, it is described as a hollow muscular tube. It is lined with ciliated epithelium. And when we say muscular, remember, you have no control over this. So we're talking about smooth muscles here. And again, lined with ciliated epithelium to move, use little cilia to move the egg cell. And this distal portion, meaning that if we're comparing to the location of the ovary, this portion is proximal, this portion is distal. So distal, proximal, because this is closer to the ovary and this is further away. Distal, right? Distant. Again, infundibulum tends to mean stalk, but what's more relevant about the infundibulum is that it is a funnel that allows that egg to go into that uterine tube, and it has those finger-like projections referred to as fimbriae that, oops, I'm so sorry, that drape over the surface of the ovary. And that inner surface is again lined with cilia that beat toward the lumen of the uterine tube. They beat towards in this direction, in this direction. And even though it's not written in the ampulla, and don't worry, I won't put it in the exam. If it's not in your notes, then don't worry about it. But something that's unique about the ampulla is that that tends to be where sperm finds the egg. Or, oh, sorry, ran away. Sperm finds our egg, or our oocyte. And then isthmus is just a small segment. It's just a segment. And this is something that I really don't feel I'll be able to ask you anything like, what is the short segment of the uterine tube? It just seems like a pointless question, but it is relevant in all likelihood for lab, where you'll have to be able to recognize that that's just about near the entry into the uterus. And that's only if it's on your list. If it's not, then you don't need to worry about it. And so, again, oocyte transport will rely on cilia moving it through the uterine tube, and also the use of smooth muscle contractions, which do peristalsis, just like we learned in digestive and urinary. And it takes, and this is a note that we're going to have to understand a little bit more. The second one, we're going to have to know a little bit more to understand that one. But this one, fertilization must occur within the first 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail next. And so the reason I wanted to start here, and I made you skip that first slide, is because I really want you to draw your attention to the inner lining of the uterus. The inner lining of the uterus, and here, this is our uterus that we're looking at here. We're looking at our perimetrium. We are seeing that it is incredibly vascular. You can see that it has arteries. And here we are seeing our endometrium, which is going to be the inner lining. And out here we are seeing the smooth muscle contractions. And so perimetrium will be the outer surface, myometrium will be the smooth muscles, and this smooth muscle layer will provide the force necessary to actually release the infant from the womb. And then endometrium. Endometrium is of particular interest because this inner layer changes with the menstrual cycle. It's referred to as the uterine cycle, or more specifically and easier, right? Because if we're dealing with the uterus, it's just easier for the uterine cycle, but that's also what we've always called the menstrual cycle. And what's particular interest of the endometrium is that this segment changes every month, and its role is to catch a fertilized embryo. And when it doesn't, it sort of resets. So we're going to have to switch to the next slide to see it, and then we'll finalize it with what these little points are. When we look at the phases of the uterine cycle, you'll see that between day 0, and this is between a 28-day period on average. Everybody's different. When you consider women's female anatomy, it will be different between individuals, and this could be genetic differences, it could be health differences, it could be a few things. But for the most part, everything is averaged between a regular monthly cycle between days 0 through 28. And so, first thing, phases of the uterine cycle, you can see we have our menstrual phase between days 0 and 7. You can see that the inner lining is being undone. And I will talk about, we'll actually have to go full circle for this. And what happens between day 7 and day 14 is that the uterus is preparing. You can even see how if you just fall all the way down, it's preparing for the hopes of catching a fertilized egg. And so, simply speaking, all of this purpose of this layer is to already provide vascularity so that if it catches an egg, that egg will implant into this layer, and all of these blood vessels will innervate into that embryo and be able to supply that embryo so that it can develop into a fetus and then eventually an infant. And so the phases are divided by days. And if we understand that this is preparing for catching an egg, then if you should hopefully understand that by 28, if it hasn't caught an egg, then what's going to happen is that it's going to deteriorate. It's going to completely be destroyed. And so this layer, the endometrium, is called the functional layer. And so this functional layer becomes less functional, right? Because an egg was not caught. So between days 0 and 7, or in other words, when the menstruation cycle is over, right, the uterine cycle is resetting, during that phase, this functional layer will dissipate or go away. And we refer to that as the menstrual phase. So between days 0 and 7, you can see that there is a destruction of this functional layer. Between days 7 and 14, you can see that the tissues begin to regenerate in that layer. And by secretory phase, between days 14 and 28, about 2 weeks, you can see that the uterus is prepared for that egg. And that's going to be an incredibly relevant time period, about day 14 to day 15. More specifically, we're just going to keep it day 15 for consistency reasons. And so day 15 is a very important day. In a second, you'll see why. And so, again, the uterus is ready, and if nothing happens at the end of the secretory phase, we reset back to menstrual phase, back to proliferative phase, and it just keeps repeating every single month. And you'll notice that there's these little points here, and we're going to have to come back to that to understand that. And if we look at microscopic tissue or pictures of the same thing, right? We have our menstrual phase, proliferative phase, our secretory phase. If you look at the 3 phases, I love this image because it's just a little cartoon image showing what exactly is going on with that layer. And it's a little harder to make up anything when you're really looking at tissues if you haven't looked at them long enough. But here you're seeing the smooth muscle portion, you're seeing the myometrium, and then you can see this is going to be the empty space of the uterus, the uterine cavity where it's at. And here is our functional layer. And you can see that during the menstrual phase, it is being destroyed. During the proliferative phase, it's where it begins to become vascular again. Those blood vessels begin going into that functional layer. You can even see them sort of here. The glands are here. The glands are here to make this portion. Let me get a better image of this here. Here you're seeing the glands, right? These glands. And you can see that eventually when we get to the secretory phase, the functional layer has developed fully. It's really increased that they're not even showing you the myometrium anymore because it's so large. It has increased in length going towards the uterine cavity. And so within the space, you can see that it is now ready to catch an egg in that layer. And so menstrual phase is described as the degeneration of that functional zone of the endometrium. It is caused by constriction of spiral arteries, and if we go back to our previous slide, we can see our spiral arteries are going to be these arteries that go into the functional layer, spiral arteries. This lasts approximately from days 1 through 7. And about 35 to 50 milliliters of blood are lost. This process of losing that layer is referred to as menstruation, the bleeding portion in a way, the releasing the lining time period. And the discharge. So for, I think my female students might be a little more familiar with what I'm talking about, but for my male students, during this phase, we all have a general idea that there's bleeding occurring during this time period. This is what's referred to as menses or menstruation. This is when the inner lining is being lost, and this is why feminine products like tampons and pads have to be utilized in order to sort of just limit the mess and catch the release of that layer. And then we have our proliferative phase. During this phase, again, the uterine glands are multiplying and restoring all the epithelia in that layer. And that is their job, is to really restore that layer back. It's a functional layer back into a functional endometrium, right, for catching fertilized eggs. And so this is under the regulation of hormones, which we're going to have to get into in a second. And we'll leave it at that. And we'll just leave it at that. And then just last thing I want to add here is I put this note here that it tends to be very glycogen rich. And I don't know if any of you recall, but glycogen was a polymer of a bunch of glucose molecules attached together. And so the mucus is very viscous because of that. And so it's mucousy. So the discharge that occurs, in other words, when menstruation's occurring, this discharge tends to be described as bloody and mucousy, not just bloody. And then finally, I'm so sorry. And then the secretory phase now, this is going to be where the glands have enlarged. We are going to secrete these glycoproteins again to support this embryo in the case of implantation. There are already arteries there to supply that uterine wall, and they are considered elongated and spiral, and that's why you see sort of that, some of them even be referred to as spiral. And they are stimulated by hormones called progesterone and estrogen. And they are under the control of something called corpus luteum. Now this is going to be our next point. And the last thing we leave off on here is begins at ovulation, meaning that day 15 for us. Well, that's why I said day 15 is an important date, because this is when we consider in a general average setting, because I get that everybody is different, but for the most part, ovulation is occurring at day 15 during this cycle, day 15, ovulation. And we'll talk about ovulation next. Now, here, this image looks like a lot, but it really is simple. If you look at this segment, this is what we just discussed. We see the lining, the inner lining of the uterus is undergoing changes. Between day 0 and 7, we are in menstrual. Between 7 and 14, we are on proliferative. And then day 15 and up to about 28, we have this perfect endometrium lining that has its spiral arteries and the uterine glands to secrete glycoproteins in order to support an embryo that lands within that space. But now, the egg. We all now need to discuss what's going on in the ovary. In the ovary, there are two components when you're thinking about the sex cells in the female system, is that the first one is the egg, the oocyte. This oocyte is going to be what we know just commonly as the egg. But that egg is always under the support of these tissues called follicular cells. Follicular cells. And it undergoes development. Like, for example, you can see this one's different from this one. You can see this one's different from this one. And then eventually, during ovulation, why is ovulation so special? Let's follow our dashed line, and you'll see day 15. Day 15. This is this is an average, right? So 14, 15. And so the egg is finally being released. Now, what does that mean for us? Right? That means that the egg is being released from the ovary. So if we're back here, this is the same picture of what you just saw, just made much more simple. You can see here's like a little miniature egg. It's developing. It has a follicle around it. You can see the follicle is getting larger, and then it just gets really large. And then finally, during ovulation, the follicle will release that egg into the uterine tube. Again, which is going to be, it's going to release the egg into the uterine tube. That's why day 15 is so significant. This is when a female is more susceptible to becoming pregnant. And, I lost my slide. Where was it? Yes, and then so you can see, now doesn't that make sense that this egg is now going to be traveling down the uterine tube, hoping to find a sperm. And if it finds a sperm, then the uterine lining is ready to go. You can see that it's now completely full with spiral arteries and uterine glands to provide glycoproteins. And if this egg gets fertilized, we're ready for implantation. Now, there's a unique thing about this, and we still have to talk about what the heck is going on with this follicle. But it's easy to understand it if you just really just understand the role of the uterine cycle, right, menstruation, with the development or the release of the egg. So this process is called the uterine cycle, and for good reason, right? We're in the uterus, so the uterine cycle. But the development of the egg inside of the ovary is referred to as the ovarian cycle. So they're occurring at the same time as the uterine cycle, or pardon, the ovarian cycle is occurring at the same time as the uterine cycle. Now, there is a unique thing as we go back, and I really like that. I love this picture because I get to explain it all sort of in one page. And you can see that the egg is released, but what about this follicle? This follicle doesn't just disappear. It plays a crucial role in controlling your hormones. It stays behind, and when it doesn't have a developing oocyte, it will then become a corpus luteum. And then it'll mature and then become something called a corpus albicans. So you want to make sure that you learn what the follicle turns into. You want to make sure you know this. Because if we look now, if we look at the layer of some hormones that are involved in the release of the egg, to release the egg and also to encourage the uterine cycle, you'll see that we have some hormones that are called LH and FSH, starting up here. You can see that the ovarian cycle is referred to as